Hello, welcome to Social Studies today. Today we're going to continue to learn about the history of the land that we live on now, the people that lived here first. So yesterday we had a very long in-depth lesson about how the first people even got to this country, what is now our country. So we talked about the land bridge. So remember the nomads, they came across the land bridge, they maybe were following the animals they were hunting, and then they dispersed. That means they spread out all around what we now call the United States. So some of the people ended up in Indiana. So we had the Adena people first, right? The Adena, mostly hunter-gatherers. And then things got more advanced and they started to have agriculture, right? Farming and animals. And that's when things, really we call them the Hopewell, right? After Adena came the Hopewell. And then after a while after that, then we got to the Mississippian people. So those were the first three cultures that lived in present-day Indiana. So we're not really sure how exactly all of those groups of people disappeared. There are a lot of different theories, which means people have ideas, but there's no proof. But however they left, they eventually left, and their civilizations just became the mounds that we see today. So after all of those early people left, we got Native Americans. So today, we are going to start talking about our state map, where different groups of Native Americans lived throughout our state. We'll talk about the ones that lived right here, which is really cool to learn about. And we're going to study 3 tribes today, and then we'll study 2 more tomorrow. So total, you're going to learn about 5 different Native American tribes, and all of them lived in Indiana. So if you could go back in time, okay, try to pretend we're back in this time period. Forget about all of our stores, all electricity, modern appliances, conveniences. Place yourself back in the time of the Native Americans, okay? So first, let's take a look at our map. And this is the Wabash River. Remember, it bashes into the side of the state and it curls up here. So we live right around in this area. So I can tell you, right where we live, we have Kickapoo, Shawnee, Miami, and there may have even been some of these other groups that at some point lived right where we live. And if you think about the Wabash River, it would be a very attractive place to live, right? I think we can already start to think about things that a river could provide that you wouldn't get if you didn't have a river. Okay, so just like yesterday, if you've got your social studies book, you can follow along with me. I'm on page 36 and 37. But I will be reading this to us. And then once we get through all of our reading later this week and next week, we'll start doing some more fun activities to figure out how these tribes are the same and how they're different. All right, so follow along with me. I'm starting right up here at the top paragraph. From the late 1600s, so before I even go on, that was like 400 years ago, so a long time ago, to the early 1800s, Native American groups from other parts of North America moved to lands that would one day be part of Indiana. The Miami and the Potawatomi were the largest and most powerful of these groups. They settled in much of what is now central and northern Indiana. So that is about where we live. The Shawnee people also settled in this area, as well as in the southeastern corner of Indiana. The Lenape people lived near the White River. And remember, the White River flows right through Indianapolis. So the Lenape people lived around there. And the Kickapoo, I know my class always likes that name, the Kickapoo lived in lands along today's border with Illinois. So that would have been this area over here, also close to where we live, because we're right here. All of the groups adapted to their new homelands in unique ways. So remember, adapting means changing to fit into your surroundings. So depending on where you lived, you would have to adapt to different things. All right, let's kick off our studies with the Miami. All right. The Miami and their clans, or that means related groups, came from the area that is now the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. Good hunting and fishing, as well as excellent farmland, drew the Miami to the region. The Miami called themselves Twitwi, which was their word for the cry of the sandhill crane. So I have showed you pictures of the sandhill cranes. Those are the large birds that migrate through our state, and they're very, very loud and noisy. So they called themselves Twitwi. All right. Now before we go on, let's take a look at our map. It says on the map, circle the name of the Native American group who lived closest to Lake Michigan. Well, that's right up here, right? So as I'm scanning down, the closest group looks to be the Potawatomi. So we could circle Potawatomi and then write the name of the river where the Lenape people lived. And if you remember what I just said, they lived on the White River. Okay, White River. So you can write that down here on the line if you'd like. All right, now moving over to the top of page 37. The Miami were farmers and hunters. Men and boys trapped and hunted animals. Women and girls gathered nuts and berries. They also planted and harvested crops. They stored foods, such as nuts and seeds, to eat during long, cold winters. Women also preserved the skins of animals and used them to make clothing. In the summer months, the Miami lived in villages. They built their villages near rivers and flatland that was good for farming. They built homes called wigwams. A wigwam is a round house built from young, flexible trees, and we will see a picture of a wigwam on the next page. This frame is covered with bark, like tree bark, and animal skins. You can see a picture of a wigwam on the next page. Whoops, I was ahead of the book. After the harvest in the fall, families moved to smaller hunting camps in the prairies. The camps allowed small groups of people to live close to the animals they hunted. This movement from village to camps was one way the Miami people adapted to the land and climate of Indiana. So if they stayed where they were in the summer and all their meat left in the winter, they can't really grow stuff in the summer, right? So while they could grow food to eat in the summer, they had to continue to follow their meat food in the winter. The last paragraph. Miami villages had councils and village leaders, or chiefs. The chief usually lived in a large structure that was also the village meeting place. The Miami believed that powerful spirits lived in humans, animals, and plants, and that these spirits protected people. Religious leaders, or shamans, were close to these spirits. They were also healers. So in their culture, that was the religion they practiced and also kind of part of their medicine. So these shaman would be healers. So using whatever they knew about the earth and plants that grew, they would do their best to try to heal people from sicknesses and injuries. All right. Now down here, number 2. It says, write the names of the natural resources used to make wigwams. Okay, remember, wigwams were their houses, and they're not like teepees. So this is a misconception. Most Native Americans do not live in teepees. Teepees were some of the Plains Indians that lived out on the big, sweeping prairies, and they made those so they could quickly take them down and follow the bison. So teepees are not what most Indians lived in. But a wigwam, if we go back up here, a wigwam is a round house built from young, flexible trees. So they make a frame out of trees. You can kind of bend them once you cut them down and tie them down. So you've got a structure, and it's a little bit of a circular shape. And then you'd find bark. Some trees you can peel the bark off and make kind of like a roof and a wall. So they'd put bark and animal skins over the tree frame. So down here on number 2, they used small trees, tree bark, and animal skins. So you can go ahead and write that down. While you do that, I am going to switch my screen. Okay, so we've already covered the Miami, so that's all we're going to learn about them. So you got to kind of keep that locked in a little chamber in your brain because we're going to move on to 2 other groups. So the second group we're going to learn about is the Potawatomi. And if you've ever been to South Bend, Indiana, which is up by where I was from as a little kid, there is a zoo called the Potawatomi Zoo in South Bend, and it is named after this tribe. So we've got this little portion about the Potawatomi Native Americans, and then we've got this portion at the bottom about the Lenape. And that's it for today. Tomorrow, we'll cover the Shawnee and the Kickapoo. Okay. All right, so follow along with me to learn about the Potawatomi. The Potawatomi came from the area that is now the states of Wisconsin and Michigan. So they came from the north and moved south. They settled in the northern part of Indiana, near Lake Michigan. There they found better soil for farming. They also found an abundance of fish in Lake Michigan and nearby rivers. The Potawatomi built wigwams similar to those made by the Miami. However, they covered their wigwams with mats of woven reeds. Reeds were easily found near the Potawatomi lands. Okay, remember they lived up by the lake and the rivers, so they had lots of cattails and reeds, and they could weave that into a structure to cover their houses. In the summer, the Potawatomi lived in longhouses. A longhouse is a large house where many people lived. Up to 7 families could live in one longhouse. People made longhouses from poles cut from trees and covered with bark. So picture that, 7 families all living in one space. So it must have been quite a big structure. All right, I'm going to pause very quickly to roll my screen up a little bit. Okay, so now we can finally see the picture of this wigwam. So this is a Lenape wigwam, but the structures of most of their wigwams were similar. They just may have been covered with different materials. But if you look very closely, you can see these small sapling trees that they used to make a frame, so they could curve them around and secure them together. And then using the frame, they could layer on top all the tree bark, animal skins, or whatever else they used to create their home. All right, so we've covered the Miami, we've covered the Potawatomi, and now we're going to learn about the Lenape. Unlike the Potawatomi and the Miami people, the Lenape came to Indiana from lands to the east. European settlers and a more powerful Native American group forced the Lenape to leave their homeland in what is now the state of Delaware. So they had initially lived somewhere else, but because of violence and maybe some warlike conditions with other tribes, they had to leave. So they've ended up here in Indiana. They traveled west, eventually settling in Indiana. There were 3 Lenape clans. Remember, clans are a related group. Wolf, Turtle, and Turkey. Sons were expected to marry women from other clans, and children belonged to their mother's clan. Lenape villages could be large, with as many as 200 residents. Groups of relatives lived in longhouses in the summer, so that sounds a lot like the Potawatomi. Like other Native Americans in Indiana, small family groups moved to camps in the winter to hunt. The oldest woman in each longhouse chose the sachem, or chief. Each sachem was a member of the village council. Chiefs were expected to look out for the well-being of the whole community. They also led the people in religious ceremonies. So your chief back then, or your sachem, that would have been very similar to like a pastor or a minister. So they would lead religious ceremonies, but they also acted kind of like a mayor. So they would take care of the people around them. And the most important part here I want you to take note of is this right here. So a lot of groups, they didn't choose their leaders this way. So let's read that again. The oldest woman in each longhouse chose the chief. So you can tell that in this tribe, the Lenape, you can tell that, number one, they had a lot of respect for their elders, right? They let the oldest woman choose. And second, a lot of times women in these time periods didn't have a whole lot of say in the choices that were made. But in the Lenape tribe, the oldest woman got to make the most important decision in selecting the chief. So that's kind of cool and kind of sets them apart from some of the other groups. So today, remember, we learned about the Miami, the Potawatomi, and the Lenape. And if you've not said those words out loud, you might want to try them, okay? Tomorrow we will learn about the Kickapoo and the Shawnee. All right? Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow.